This video is a continuation of a discussion that we began back in part 50. In this discussion, we're discussing how to modify input parameters. If you haven't already seen part 50, you should take a look up here where you can find a link to part 50. And additionally, while you're looking up there, you'll also discover links to the following two videos for a total of 4 videos in which we're looking at modifying input parameters. Let's take a look at why you cannot modify input parameters. So take a look at our simple example here. We have a workflow. It has 3 schema elements, a start and end, and a schema element called E1. Let's assume that that schema element is a scriptable task. Now, as you can see in this workflow, we have one variable in the workflow. It's an input parameter called myvar. Now, what you're going to be tempted to do at times with your input parameters is do things like increment the value of the input parameter. For instance, if the myvar input parameter was a number and we wanted to add 1 to that number, the first thing we're going to need to be able to do is see what the current value is that's stored in myvar. So as you already know, that would require that we have an inward binding. And as we know from before, the name of the variable inside of E1, the local variable inside of E1, could have the same name or could have a separate name. For our purposes, let's assume that the input parameter name is myvar and the local variable inside of E1 to which it's inwardly bound, let's assume it's also called myvar. So far things are looking good. We've got our inward binding. We'll be able to see what's in myvar and add 1 to it. But what if we did attach some code to our E1 scriptable task? What if we said myvar equals myvar plus 1? Now, the first thing to be real clear on right now is any code that you write, such as the code I'm illustrating here, myvar equal myvar plus 1, any code that you write that way, all of the variables that you see in that code are local variables. They're variables within the schema element. They may have the same name as an external variable, such as our input parameter called myvar, but the code inside of your scriptable task contains local variables. And if we just make changes to those local variables without any bindings, we're not working with the workflow variables. We're working with the local variables in the schema element. But when you do the trickery that we've illustrated with the red line, when you create a binding from that input parameter called myvar to the local variable in E1 called myvar, then we can potentially run code such as what you see illustrated on the screen here. And this code will work in part. For instance, everything on the right side of the equal sign will work. Notice we're trying to say myvar plus 1. In order to do that expression, myvar plus 1, we need to know what's in the variable called myvar. Well, that local variable called myvar is inwardly bound to the input parameter called myvar, so the code on the right side of this expression will work. We can successfully say myvar plus 1 and calculate the result of that expression. But the left side of our expression, so the stuff on the left of the equal sign, is not going to work. When you say variable name equals, that's an assignment. In this case here, we're saying local variable called myvar equals, and then we're going to set it to some value. Now, the value we're going to be able to calculate successfully, but we're not going to be able to perform the assignment because that local variable called myvar does not have an outward binding to anything at all. Even if we did manage to set the value of the local variable called myvar in the scriptable task, nothing outside of this scriptable task will know that we did that. So we need an outward binding. Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, no problem. All I have to do is create an output parameter. We'll call it myvar since it's the same variable. And as long as we create that output parameter with an outward binding to E1, then everything will be good. But that won't work. You can't do that outward binding because you can't even create an output parameter called myvar. You cannot, in general, have workflow variables such as an input parameter and an output parameter with the same name. I cannot have an input parameter called myvar and an output parameter called myvar. vRO does not allow that. Same thing's true with attributes. Whether I have an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute called something, none of the other types can have a variable with that same name. So only an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute can be called myvar. So we can't achieve what we're trying to do here, and this is why attempting to change the value of an input parameter is destined to fail. So now that we understand what the problem is, let's continue onwards a bit and take a look at what we're going to need to do instead. Now the first thing we're going to do is add a new schema element that's going to be at the very beginning of our workflow. And we're going to take the code that was formerly in that first schema element and we're going to move it later on in our workflow. So whereas in the previous slide we saw that E1 was doing the code that we see here on the screen, now we're going to have E1 do something different. We're going to have E1 copy the value of the input parameter to an attribute. Now notice, if you will, we've changed the name of our input parameter. It's essentially the same name as before, but we've prepended the letters IN onto the beginning of the variable to make it clear this is an input parameter. Additionally, we're going to still have a variable in our workflow called myvar, but it's not going to be an input parameter. Rather, this time it's going to be an attribute. So by virtue of having an inward binding, as we see illustrated with the red arrow, from in myvar to some variable inside of E1, that'll allow us to see in E1 what the current value is of in myvar. Now, since we want to copy the value that's in the input parameter to the attribute, that means we're going to be writing a value out to the myvar attribute, which means we're going to need an outward binding. But effectively, if we can set something up like this, we'll be able to do what we were trying to do originally. We won't actually be changing the input parameter, but we will have a variable in our workflow called myvar that we'll be able to pass between different schema elements, and we'll be able to see initially in the attribute called myvar, we'll see initially it has the value of the input parameter, but we'll be able to make changes to the attribute later on our workflow. So again, anywhere else in the workflow that we want to, we can do an inward binding to the attribute called myvar so that we can see what is currently stored in that variable. And with an outward binding, we'll be able to change at any time we want the value of the myvar attribute. Join me in the next video where we'll explore one technique for modifying input parameters in vRO.